Hey, everybody. Welcome to Fiorella Isabel, Fiorella in Moscow. I almost said the combo couch because I'm so used to saying it. But Pasta's not here, obviously. So I'm actually going to try to do some more independent interviews on my regular channel. So if you are on the combo couch and haven't subscribed to Fiorella in Moscow, which will probably change to Fiorella Isabel because of certain things. Um, I will inform you all about later. Uh, go ahead and subscribe because I really do need to be able to live stream, maybe from a mobile phone, etc. So that will help out too. But please subscribe, and I'm going to be doing many more of these one-on-one interviews with different journalists and personalities as well. But in particular, I have one of my favorite people here today. Uh, and she is amazing at investigative reporting. She has so much knowledge on the region of West Asia, the Middle East, and really her reporting is severely underrated. Her experience in both Syria and Palestine is really something that I always like to discuss and don't get tired of. So Vanessa Beeley is here, and she has her own Substack, by the way. So you guys should all go follow her on Twitter and find her Substack. Welcome, Vanessa.
Hi, it's really good to be back on with you. One of my favorite people also.
Well, thank you. And if Vanessa, it looks like she's her skin is flawless, and it is, but she doesn't have the
I
best
don't know
internet
what's
connection
happening with
right
the
now.
net.
And I totally understand that. Being when I was in Iran, it was like impossible to have internet. So that was, yeah. So
Yeah, no, Iran is it's one of the worst. In Lebanon and
yeah.
but Syria in the last actually since October the 7th, the internet has been gradually going worse and worse. So I don't know if it's related.
But we are happy that we can at least listen to some of your wise understanding of what's going on. And I hate, the fact when I go to work and when we do certain things as journalists, we refer to this as a conflict because it has been a conflict, but the reality is that it is one that has uh, uh, an obvious oppressor, an obvious wrongdoing by Israel's part that's been documented not only by journalists but by the UN itself. Yesterday, I was doing a lot of research on reporting as to what the UN outlined, even back in 1983, before the establishment of the Palestinian, not the Palestinian, like the reestablishment with the Palestinian independence in 1988. Before all of that, the UN was already getting so much of this reporting of the violations of what Israel was doing in terms of, cutting water, in terms of not allowing the influx of materials and food supply, basically creating this apartheid state that you very well know of. And the fact that it has been documented by these supposed agencies that oversee, right, what is happening in the world and the injustices, and nothing has been done to me after all these years, before I was born, for crying out loud. I mean, and we're still here talking about the same things, and yet having to convince people that this did not start, obviously, on October 7th, but further having to convince people that there is even a problem and be allowed to use the word quote unquote genocide, because I have already gotten in trouble by YouTube on a different video I did discussing this. So I can tell it's gonna be fun. There's been a lot of having to go around in this way. So I want to hear from you, Vanessa. The first thing I'm going to ask you, really, is what drove you to really get into this? Because I know this is a question that we've never discussed really together one-on-one, but it's a question that is important to me because I think what motivates people to do this work is really, really important. some people don't do this work for the right reasons, in my opinion. And so I want to know what led you to this work that you do now.
I think it's a combination of things. I mean, I think it started probably, you know, I grew up, I keep explaining this, I kind of grew up in an environment where particularly the Palestinian issue was always the conversation at the dinner table, with my father's involvement in actually trying to prevent the settlement of European Jews after the Second World War in Palestine. He advised the government then, Ernest Bevin, who was the foreign minister, was advised by my father not to allow it to happen because it would lead to decades of bloodshed, putting very succinctly what my father warned them of. And of course, that's exactly what has come true. And that very small Overton window in British government, where actually there were a number of MPs pushing back against what was going on in Palestine and against the, you know, the handing over of the British mandate to the UN, the partitioning of Palestine and so on. And of course, they came under attack from the Zionist terrorist groups, Irgun and the Stern Gang and so on. And then the rest is kind of history. So you know, for me, I think at an early age, I wasn't politically aware, but I was subliminally kind of absorbing this entire situation. And it wasn't really until after my dad's death that I tried for the first time since he retired to go back to Cairo, where he was ambassador during the Suez Crisis, and then he was called back in the Six-Day War, and that's when I was there as a little 3-year-old. So that tells you my age. And after my dad died, I started to go through all his papers. And then in 2012, I tried for the first time. Well, first of all, I went to Egypt to kind of rediscover his role in Egypt. And then from there to Gaza. And actually, that's where I met Eva Bartlett, was at the Rafah border. I think that was in July 2012. And then so that was a failed attempt, I think, because at the time there were 16 Egyptian soldiers had been killed during Ramadan, so everything kind of shut down. Anyway, eventually I got into Gaza. I entered through the tunnels. And I think 3 days after I entered, the 2012 Israeli aggression began. Now, I had gone to Gaza more as an activist than as a journalist, very, in a way, similar to Eva's path to journalism. You know, I was involved in working with orphans there, working with kids with PTSD, but then suddenly got caught up in the Israeli aggression. And I think from that point on, when you see certain things, you can't unsee them. And so they become something that is so important to explain to the outside world, that is very sheltered, both deliberately by the media, of course, and by the governments, but also just because of a lack of awareness of what situations are really like on the ground. And the importance of raising that awareness, and the importance of transmitting the voices of people that otherwise wouldn't be heard, is probably my greatest motivator, particularly from Syria, for example, where I started working in the end in 2016. I'd been trying to come in since 2015. I basically stayed in Gaza 2012 and gone back in 2013 with the intention to live there and to continue the work with the kids and helping them with the constant PTSD, ADHD symptoms, autism-like symptoms, not necessarily autism, but all of the symptoms of the daily trauma that they endured as kids. And then for health reasons, I had to come back to Europe. And that's when I got more involved with Eva in Syria. And as I said, from 2015, I tried to get into Syria. I got in 2016. And then it became really a purpose to bring out the voices, the stories, the narratives from the people that were literally fighting this regime change war and being disappeared and ignored and effectively left to die because nobody understood what was going on inside Syria. And I think, you know, that has to be really the greatest motivator, is to put myself in a situation where I'm able to communicate with those people that are really not being given a voice by Western media, by colonial media, by colonial governments, because of course they're trying basically to destroy the country that those people are speaking on behalf of. So yeah, I guess that's, if I have to examine it, I guess that's my biggest motivator.
And it's interesting because what you said about, you know, coming at it from an activist standpoint, for sure, that is also how I came about. I mean, I did study, I think you mentioned this too. I did study public relations and a bit of journalism in school, but it wasn't, what we were taught was very much, you know, just normal, basic status quo journalism. It wasn't necessarily coming from the standpoint of really, it was about telling a story that was attention grabbing rather than telling a story that was truthful and beneficial and needed to be told from those who really didn't have the platform to tell it. And when you come from it from an activist standpoint, I think it's a little bit different. Would you say that coming from an activist standpoint um, shaped the way you do your work versus somebody that perhaps went through just you know, education of going to college for journalism and then suddenly, you know, covering these conflicts, you kind of get a little bit more, I think, removed. You can remove yourself more easily, I think.
And I think, you know, these days, a lot of the analysts don't actually go to the places they're talking about. And while their analysis might be very good based on, you know, reading geopolitical events and so on, I think until, we've talked about this before, until you actually go to the places you talk about, it's very difficult to understand the cultures, to understand the people themselves, the history, the heritage, everything, you know. And I think when you come at it as an activist, it means that really you want to immerse yourself in that. You want to immerse yourself in the stories of the people, the stories of the history, the country, the civilization, the whole culture. It's not just about analyzing events from a very realpolitik point of view, and that's also a very valuable resource, by the way. But from my perspective, it's kind of not enough. Like, I get really bored if I'm just sitting somewhere for a couple of weeks and I'm just writing or reporting. I'm literally champing at the bit to get out and be talking to people and get out into the, you know, into the places themselves to really understand. And, you know, that's always been one of the frustrations with Gaza in particular, because it's so difficult to get into. Even, you know, not talking about the current events where it's virtually impossible. But even prior to that, it's very difficult. It's very restricted coming from the occupied territories through the Erez crossing. I mean, I know for certain myself and Eva would not be allowed through there. Coming from Rafah, even though it's Egyptian territory, you wouldn't know it because the Zionists still pretty much control who can enter through Rafah. I had this experience myself. And basically on the other side of the Rafah crossing, so between Rafah and Gaza, there's a no man's land, which is policed by the Zionist forces, right? So Egypt doesn't really have a say in what happens at the Rafah border. And we're seeing that to a large degree, the fact that the humanitarian convoys are not being allowed to enter Gaza. Why? it's Egyptian sovereign territory, but it's under the control of the Zionists, in my opinion. So I just think, for me, I think where I feel most fulfilled is when I'm literally out and about and talking to people. And I think, when you're working out of a YouTube office, or you're working out of London or Washington or New York, it's harder to get that real empathy with people. And to some degree, I think you can analyze from quite a two-dimensional perspective. Because until you bring in that human perspective, like, for example, you went to Iran, right? You knew before you went that much of the narratives that were appearing in Western media were very likely untrue. But until you go there, until you experience the fact that in the main streets of Tehran, in the markets and the malls and so on, virtually nobody's wearing hijab.
Yeah.
And until you go there, you don't actually experience firsthand the hypocrisy and the mendaciousness of Western media in the narratives that it's pushing out, right? So it gives that other layer, which I think for me is the most valuable part of what I do.
That's a good point. And I think, you have to go look at the macro. Like you said, it's good to be able to analyze things from the perspective of, who benefits from this, where's this going, and that's the macro sense. But it's also necessary not to forget about the ongoing micro in terms of what's going on the ground and the people and their experience. And I found that in Latin America as well. I mean, there was definitely points, in Latin America that you had to really sift through what was going on, the nuances going on, and for example, in Brazil, or a very deeply political, it's a very deeply complicated political environment, and the gaslighting from Americans here saying, so and so Lula is a sellout and all this stuff, but it's like, but you're missing the entire context of everything else and what happened in the last few years with the economy, the homelessness on the street. You're not talking to people who are like, we want more chicken in our fridge, we want more eggs, and so you miss all of that. And what you mentioned too in Iran, that was just completely insane to me. I mean, I knew, like you said, what, but it's a whole other thing to literally be. I just arrived at the airport and there's a woman in front of a police officer with nothing on, and she's just like going about her life, and I'm getting told that I'm awful for saying this, which is the truth, and that I'm like promoting the Iranian regime. And you couldn't believe they went through my Instagram and they started saying, how can you promote this if you don't believe in it? And it was crazy. But you really do get an entire different sense. And I think there is nothing like really going on the ground. And just like you, I'm always itching to really go somewhere. In fact, I get told like I'm always somewhere else, but it's just for me, for the longest time, traveling in a sense of really understanding where people are coming from is the essence of really, I think, good journalism, because then you have to understand the history, you have to understand the dynamics. And I think that's something that you can't really put a price on. And I just don't think we get enough of that these days, unfortunately. So I do want to ask you though.
And I think it's sorry, go on.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No. I mean, I think it is just important because we are incredibly sheltered in the West generally, particularly in the United States, from connection with other cultures. And I think we're seeing it. We saw it with Russia, where it was so easy to get people to kind of criminalize Russians and demonize Russians. Now we see it with China, right? Because China is not a culture that I know a huge amount about. I mean, I've met people from China TV here, and they're really sweet people. They're really easy to talk to, really easy to get on with. They have a really great work ethic. So I think this this understanding of other cultures enables you to just nuance your analysis. That's my point. You know, I see a lot of people in the West coming up with great analysis, but when they reach a kind of slightly nuanced or complex crossroads, they kind of don't know how to deal with it, right? And that's where that extra understanding, that extra immersion in those cultures does help. Sorry, that was a bit repetitive, but I just wanted to say it.
No, I mean, it's just I feel like I'm having a conversation with I just such a kindred spirit when I talk to you. It's like you get it. I don't know how to, you just get it. So I do have to ask you about the fact that we've been seeing, unfortunately, today, right? The complete hypocrisy of the Israeli quote unquote government, right? The Israeli factions that have basically been alleging, as they have been doing so for a long time, that Hamas has been hiding out in hospitals and schools and refugee camps. And they consider Hamas terrorists. So they say, they don't even say Hamas anymore. They just say terrorists with explosives. And that has been completely debunked time and time again. But today, there was something that I saw that you shared as well, and that I shared. And it was the a press release from the Euro Med Monitor. And I'm just going to read it, and then we're going to talk about it, because they say they said that Israel has turned the Shifa Medical Complex in Gaza into a detention center, which they have done this before. The Israeli forces stormed in large numbers at the Al-Shifa Medical Complex in Gaza City and turned it into military barracks and a detention center where patients, displaced persons, and healthcare professionals are subjected to different forms of abuse, Euromed Human Rights Monitor said in a statement on Wednesday. They expressed fears of killings and executions as its teams documented sporadic gunfire in the hospital since the early minutes of the raid, stressing that the Al-Shifa complex did not witness any gunfire other than from the Israeli forces. The Geneva-based organization highlighted that the Israeli army is the only party controlling the scene inside the Al-Shifa medical complex amid a total media blackout. No third party or international organization was permitted to be present inside, which raises doubts about any Israeli narrative that would be released later, which they already are releasing. Euromed Monitor further pointed out that the Israeli allegations about the use of the Al-Shifa medical complex for military purposes do not require extended hours of searching and raiding. Therefore, there are concerns that the army might be creating the scene that might be released later. The Israeli army has deliberately exaggerated over the past few days the goal of storming the Al-Shifa complex, portraying it as a military achievement and inciting its soldiers against the medical facility. Euromed Human Rights Monitor calls on the Israeli army to withdraw from the Al-Shifa complex immediately and fulfill its obligations under the law of armed conflicts, which they're not going to do. But so I just want to get your take on that. I know also Eva Bartlett shared her experience on this sort of thing as well. If you want to give us some insight on that.
Well, I mean, you know, in 2012, Shifa Hospital was the main hospital that we were working around, because under the Israeli aggression, Shifa was actually built in 1946. So it was built under the British mandate even before the establishment of the Zionist or settler colonialist state by the British. Gradually, I guess, over years, it's had, you know, different wings added to it. It's the largest hospital in Gaza. It's certainly the one where all of the emergency cases will go to. So the fact that Shifa is now basically non-operational means that the other smaller hospitals that are also being bombed and attacked are not going to have the capability of dealing with the emergency cases that Shifa has been taking in, right? As far as I know, the IOF is already walking back the claims that there were hostages underground in Shifa, or that there were weapons underground in Shifa. We've all seen the images of the so-called tunnel, which is an elevator shaft So, I mean, basically, the entire kind of, propaganda has just, as usual, fallen apart, just as it did about the atrocities on October the 7th, But I do believe that at some point we may see some kind of false flag event. That's my fear, is that they're going to create a story, and we all know how fast those stories can travel and enable further atrocities by Israel before they're kind of unraveled, right? So that is one fear. The other fear, of course, is that Al Shifa Hospital is basically now completely taken over, as far as I can understand, by the IOF. Doctors are not being allowed to travel from one section to another. The surgery operating rooms have shut down completely. People that were on ICU are simply not getting treatment. I mean, the thing is, I can't imagine a worse form of torture than doctors not being able to save their patients, including premature babies in incubators that are now being kept warm just with blankets because the electricity isn't working. Operations that were already being done without any anesthetic, without medicines, right? I mean, it's very difficult in the 21st century to even imagine this kind of extended atrocity that the Zionist entity has been meting out against the Gazan civilians, the Palestinians, but particularly against paramedics, against medical staff, nursing staff, etc. I mean, it's hideous. And as I said, I was in Shifa Hospital on a regular basis in 2012. And as Dr. Mads Gilbert said, if there were military centers, military headquarters under Shifa Hospital, we would have known about it. It would be impossible to not see Hamas operatives entering the hospital and disappearing into tunnels or whatever they're presumed to have done, right? And Mads Gilbert, as he said himself, he wouldn't work there if he thought that were the case.
Yeah, and here's the thing, and it's kind of crazy. This is where I get irritated at the way social media works. Is you get these people sharing on Twitter, oh, we have proof of these Hamas tunnels, and these people just get so many views, and then you have the Israeli bots or whatever they are just coming in and saying, see, and it's just very frustrating. But you're absolutely right. Israel is losing the PR war. They're losing the propaganda war. They are getting extremely desperate, and it's really I haven't in my years seen this level of support for Palestine ever, which is positive. But I also, and I'm not trying to be cynical here, but I also know that that means very little in terms of what these governments do, in terms of what the U.S. government and Israel do, because the U.S. government continues to facilitate this sort of outlet for Israel to do whatever it wants. I mean, they don't ever take Israel and say, hey, you need to take accountability for XYZ. They don't even play that game. They just fully say we stand with Israel. Then you had this Washington, D.C. Zionist, march masked under the cloak of anti-Semitism, right? And it's just masked completely. And they're basically just shouting that they want to kill Palestinians, but because they have this mask of anti-Semitism, they get away with it. And then you have the Israelis making videos, just like we saw in Ukraine. The Ukrainian army make videos that were just productions of films. You have them make this video, and if you can show it, Jamie, and you can mute it if you want. It's just a video of them handing out some sort of like aid and helping the residents at the hospital. They're handing out humanitarian aid, and it's insane that people are buying this, right? Because here they are. This is from I-24 News English, and it says that IDF troops are delivering humanitarian aid to the Al-Shifa hospital while continuing to sweep the compound for explosives and terrorist infrastructure in a precise and targeted operation against Hamas. It's precise and targeted. It's you know, it's, and they use these words, and this is what this press release alleged, that they were going to form a different narrative, that they were going to use this time to basically create an alternative reality, that we've seen time and time again, is false, right?
Yeah, and I mean, there was that image of the IOF soldier giving water to the old man. And then his family member basically said he was shot 5 minutes later. And that, that same scene happened in 2015 with an elderly lady, where an IOF soldier was giving water, and then 10 minutes later she's dead. So there is no disconnect between the murderous language, the ethnic cleansing, genocidal, dehumanization language that you're hearing from the Zionist leadership and from the Zionist forces that are now inside Gaza. And there is nothing on this planet that is going to make me believe, after everything they've done, they're going to suddenly appear 4 soldiers with a couple of packages of so-called humanitarian aid. I mean, it's just ridiculous that people are even buying into this when they've basically stopped any humanitarian aid convoys entering Gaza, either by bombing Rafah or just simply closing the border. And you talk about the United States, all of this rhetoric that they're calling on Netanyahu to back off. Well, I'm going to call BS on that, because, when Blinken was there, when Nasrallah gave his first speech, what happened immediately after that? There was some of the worst massacres that we'd seen at that point in the entire genocidal operation. And the thing is that the Zionists have been perfectly clear about what they want to achieve, which is effectively not only in Gaza, the ethnic cleansing of all Palestinians, but also in the West Bank. They see this as an opportunity. And even Biden said right at the beginning, okay, let's just finish them, right? So there's a Kennedy, I think, gave us, Robert Kennedy Jr. gave us the clearest insight into what this is all about, right? Which is about preventing Russia, China, Iran influence and control of commodities. That's what it comes down to. So whether you're going to talk about the Ben Gurion Canal, or whether you're going to talk about the fact that the US is increasing its military footprint in Israel itself, in the occupied territories, in the Negev, it's building a base, it's increasing its military personnel there. It basically sees an opportunity to expand its military presence within the Zionist entity itself. So within the occupied territories, cleanse it of the Palestinians, escalate the conflict to the point where potentially they can come into confrontation even with Iran. That's before you bring in also the kind of the weird religious cult aspect of it all, which I do think is a very real part of this. The whole Temple Mount movement, the belief that there has to be an Armageddon for the second coming of Christ, that is believed by the majority of Christian Zionists, and Christian Zionists outnumber Zionists by, I think it's 10-1. So that's a scary number of people, the majority of which I think are in the US. I don't have all the figures on that. That really believe that this kind of apocalyptic vision is necessary to fulfill the prophecy of their religious cultism. I mean, I'm not an expert on all of this. I've been kind of dipping into it and reading up on it. So there's a whole melee of stuff going on right now. But basically the bottom line is the Palestinians are expendable, but not only the Palestinians, also the Israelis. I think what Kennedy made very clear in his statement, he didn't mention the Israeli people. He just explained what Israel is as a zone, not what it is as a people. So for me, it's been absolutely clear, even from the beginning, that the Israeli people are just as expendable as the Palestinian people. It's just they have a bit more value because, you know, they play into this propaganda that is necessary, and they shore up the government in within the occupied territories, right? But ultimately, those people are just as expendable.
It's kind of interesting you say that, because it's almost like the same type of policy the U.S. has with the American people. They give us more, nicer things. We have access to more things, but at the end of the day, the uh, the the quality of life is completely just declining for everyday American people, for everyday Europeans, and for everyday
Yeah,
people in general in Western Europe. And and that is, of course, despite the fact that they are supposed to be the beautiful garden, right? They're supposed to be the ones that enjoy all of this. They're not enjoying all of this. So and Kennedy, I have never heard somebody so perfectly
yeah,
encapsulate the purpose of Israel as Kennedy did, and the fact that he did it so well
yeah,
and proved us, unfortunately, right, Vanessa, when we said that the Israel-Palestine issue, for those RFK Jr. supporters, is not just one issue that you can just push
yeah,
aside. Not to mention, of course, even going beyond the fact that if you can just push millions of people out of Palestinians and disregard them, okay, if you have no heart, fine. But the fact is further that it's not just that issue. We knew that his rhetoric and his policy of being a Zionist was going to extend in his relationships with Iran. He even mentioned Venezuela, the Venezuelan regime. He
yes.
went on,
Oh, yeah,
he
and you
hit
have.
every
I forgot that because you have Hezbollah in Venezuela.
yeah. Well, he hit every point, like a neocon. It could have came from any neocon that we've had
Yeah.
in the United States. And so he basically cemented himself as yet another warmonger that's trying to be president. And it really makes you feel like we don't really have any sort of salvation. And that's what I want to really get to is, we see these protests, we see people in the streets, Americans, Europeans, everybody in the West in the streets. We even saw Russians showing support for Palestinians. We saw people all over the world. Belize literally is cutting ties with Israel. It's joining a heap of other countries doing so, especially in the global South. But then, nothing happens. We see the UN saying Israel bad, but nothing gets done.
But
You see Guterres
yeah.
say, this is terrible. This is becoming a graveyard for children. But they say Palestinians have been killed. Our own members have been killed. Who killed them? Antonio, who killed them? They can't say
Exactly.
Israel killed
Yeah.
these people.
Yeah,
It's
exactly. And
frustrating.
I think at that point, I guess what I'm feeling right now is, okay, look, what I'm tired of is people having opinions on what the resistance should do. It's none of our business as Westerners. Our governments are entirely responsible for what is happening right now. And as far as I'm concerned, if the armed resistance factions in Palestine led an operation on the 7th of October to basically take hostages, that's a legitimate policy, in my view, from a resistance coalition, which it is. Again, we won't get into the whole Hamas thing, but it's a resistance coalition which stretches across Gaza and the West Bank, and they're working in absolute cohesion, which is probably really because the West and by default the Zionist entity work on division. They work on divide and rule. And so for them, this is a complete anathema because now they're seeing cohesion and collaboration between all the resistance factions. So from the Islamists to the communists to the left wing, it's unheard of actually throughout history because they've worked on dividing. And they've even worked on dividing the Palestinian resistance from the resistance axis, so from Iran and Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Hezbollah, etc. Right? And they were successful for a period of time, but not now. You know, and for me, what happened at the emergency summit, the Arab League summit, was again, the lines were drawn between those that are really committed to resistance against neocolonialism and imperialism and globalism, and those that aren't, right? So although it was like sort of gut-wrenchingly disappointing that they didn't go with the proposal that was put forward by 11 countries, sort of headed up by Syria. Still, I think Iran's presence and the speech by President Assad made it very clear where they stand from a resistance perspective. Then you have Yemen, you know, beloved Yemen, as we always say here, because they are completely taking the war to Israel, right? And Israel has been absolutely instrumental in the destruction of Yemen since 2015. So they have, you know, they have a grudge against Israel anyway. And now they've put the embargo basically on the Red Sea, so no Zionist shipping is going to be allowed in the Red Sea. We know that the US is sending nuclear-powered submarines and other naval vessels to the area, potentially to confront Yemen on Israel's behalf, just as it rushed to Palestine to Israel's defense. But what does this tell me? This tells me that, as Nasrallah said in 2006, Israel is as weak as a spider's web. And that is also what has been demonstrated. What can it do? It can just bomb women and children, right?
Yep.
It's not winning the war on the ground. It really isn't. It's had huge losses. The US has now had huge losses in Syria from the resistance attacks, and the Syrian Arab Army has actually itself sent 15 missiles into the Konoko occupied oil field, US occupied oil field in the northeast. So that's the first time that the Syrian army has directly engaged in the northeast. And what is the US doing? It's kind of messing around with a few strikes here and there. It doesn't want to, it's actually, I think, demonstrating itself, just as it was in Ukraine, to be weak. And what's it doing? It's triggering its proxies. It's triggering ISIS instead to carry out attacks against Syrian Arab Army positions. So I think, as President Assad said at the summit, you know, we are seeing what the Palestinian resistance has done is to give a huge opportunity of transformation. And as he said, you know, we have to take advantage of this opportunity that they have sacrificed their lives for us to have. And he's absolutely right. So I think, yes, the protests are great. Do they achieve anything? What I guess they do achieve is that people here can see the solidarity, and that does have greater importance than people realize. I mean, I can say that from here in Syria. It does boost the morale here and in Palestine. I can't speak for them, but I remember when I was in Gaza and there were protests going on. It does help. So that's, you know, I would still say they're important. But for me, what's the most important thing? Forget about your opinion of how the resistance should do what they're doing. Let them do it and just support them in solidarity in their enshrined right to armed resistance against probably one of the most brutal occupation forces in history, that is entirely backed by the other most brutal occupation forces in history, which is the US and the UK and certain EU member states. I'm not saying don't have an opinion, but we should just literally be supporting them unconditionally, just as the US has supported Israel unconditionally since its establishment, right? That's what we should learn from, because that's what empowers the resistance to fight the war they're going to have to fight. We're not here to fight it for them, so let them fight it.
I think, Vanessa, that comes from a lack of understanding as to what the resistance is, right? And you
Mm.
you were like, we're not going to get into the Hamas thing, but it is there are several
Yeah.
factions that are beyond Hamas. I mean, it's crazy to me how people don't really have this information, but that's also part of it, because not understanding what the resistance is and how cohesive they are now more than ever really paints a picture that you know Palestine and Gaza are completely entirely left alone, and that look at all the casualties, and just looking at it from that perspective, obviously the loss of life is completely disgusting and could have been entirely avoidable, but there is this other missing part, that's really, this is an opportunity. This was a desire, in a sense, of fighting back against Israel and the oppression that has been ongoing, and with the silence of many. I mean, there were
Mm.
pro-Palestinian protests a few years ago. I covered them, and all of this, but it just wasn't. What did it do? Right? It just, like you said, it raises the morale. It lets people know they're not alone. But in terms of changing anything,
Mm.
it didn't. And a lot of the world really placed a blind eye into what was happening in Palestine, at least, at the very least, justifying the existence of Israel as it is, an occupation, and pretending that it is a legitimate state, and that everything else that happened from the Nakba, or even before, on, is irrelevant. And so I think that's where that is coming from, because people don't really see the resistance, because they don't see the resistance of the plans, they don't see the information coming out. And why would you? I mean, these are things that will help them in the long run. How do you tell people, though, that the resistance, to trust the resistance, to support the resistance, if they're just seeing endless casualties on Palestinians? And what do you think the resistance will do moving forward if things continue the way they are?
Well, I was reading actually earlier today an interview, and I've just blanked on his name, but he's basically a member of Hezbollah, a senior member of Hezbollah, and he put out a statement which he said, we're simply not going to allow the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, and if Israel persists in this, it will be the end of Israel. That's a pretty strong statement to be putting out, right? So, I think, especially for me here, because there are moments when even I get frustrated and, like, I want to go to the border and enter Palestine and just, I get it. And there's a huge, there are, I think it's 2 million Palestinians in diaspora here who are also, um, I wouldn't say frustrated, but they are hurting to see their people suffering in this way, as are Palestinians in Jordan, in Lebanon, and so on, right? But what more and more, the more people I talk with, I do get the idea that this strategy was thought out for many years, right? Even though the Palestinian resistance factions are operating cohesively, and until now, they haven't said that they want actual intervention. So really, it's this respect of sovereignty. It's a little bit like when people say, why doesn't Russia bomb Israel when Israel bombs Syria? Well, it comes down to respect of sovereignty. This is Syria's war, right? So even Iran doesn't get involved except with discussion and negotiation and so on, and collaboration with Damascus. The same for Russia, the same for Hezbollah. It's not, in a sense, it's their war because they're fighting as allies, but it's hands off when it comes to making the decisions, right? And that's a very important, because we're so used to NATO member states, in particular, just acting in such a lawless way. We forget what sovereignty really means. And Palestinian sovereignty is just as important. as Lebanese sovereignty, as Syrian sovereignty. So I think it's kind of, in a way, it's a very important message. At the same time, of course, Hezbollah is occupying huge numbers of Israeli soldiers in the north, so preventing them going to Gaza, right? That's one thing. Nasrallah made that very clear. But I think at the same time, I think every resistance country is well aware that any action on their part, the typical Israeli reaction is to provoke an attack, and then they have the excuse of self-defense, right? So I think everyone is just approaching this very strategically. But we've seen in Syria that the Palestinian resistance factions in the south have been given permission to fire missiles into the Jolan settlements, the Israeli annexed territory. Syrian airspace is available to any resistance factions that are attacking Israel or attacking the US occupation bases. We have now the creation of SWAT, Al Jazeera Arabia, which means it's coming from kind of the Gulf state region. They've been recently created. They're firing missiles into occupied territories. So it's kind of interesting at the moment. In Syria, you have this escalation between the Syrian army and the US directly. You have the creation of new resistance factions that are kind of popping up in different places. So it's almost adding to the confusion because nobody knows who they are, nobody knows who's behind them, but they are joining the fight, right? So it's almost as if the resistance axis is taking a lesson from Western strategy, and it's creating its own form of confusion and secrecy over what it's doing. So it is actually, I think, succeeding in confusing the West. And the Zionist entity, I don't think, has any control over what it's doing right now, other than to behave in a kind of genocidal, maniacal way, which is what it has always done, basically.
You know, uh, I agree with the confusion part because so many people and so many analysts don't always know exactly how to have a certain analysis about what they're doing, and the opinions of people are, I think, similar in terms of what when it came to Russia, right? Why doesn't Russia just finish Ukraine? Why doesn't this happen? Why doesn't Iran help Russia finish Ukraine? I mean, these are things that people who have never been in war and have are just sitting on at home on their computers say without understanding the rationale. First of all, I think everybody who wants to avoid the escalation into a world war, because again, we could go into a world war scenario from this region as well as from the Asia Pacific region, and even from the Russia Ukraine region if we have something escalated, even though obviously to Zelensky's demise he's taken the back burner now instead, and Bibi has come as the favorite child of the US. But I think eventually they're going to get rid of both of them and replace them with somebody else. But we'll see. That's a little irrelevant. But the thing that is really frustrating is for me looking at the way diplomacy functions. Yes, there is a time to be diplomatic. There is a time to have conversations, especially when you're trying to avoid war. However, when I see the UN, as we mentioned, still pushing this two-state solution, and then I see Russia and other states pushing it, and I understand that, and their diplomacy, the Russian diplomacy goes far beyond. I mean, it's insane. With Ukraine, with the United States, I mean, but they still, push this two-state solution scenario, which again was tried and failed because Israel didn't keep up their end of the bargain, right? It was tried and it failed, and it never got done because they kept expanding and in their occupation into the West Bank, and they kept literally slowly genociding Palestinians in Gaza. So obviously it didn't work, even though Palestine under Yusuf Arafat agreed that, okay, we're going to give up 78% of our territory. They agreed to that. They actually agreed to that, and which is insane. But it didn't matter because it was going to continue. So for me, this two-state solution is really um, it's not a solution because you can't coexist with
No, and
countless and
especially not
countless.
now. It's impossible now.
No, you can't.
After
They
this,
want to annihilate
yeah,
Palestinians, right? So how do you coexist with that? Not only do they want to annihilate Palestinians, but they want to expand, as you mentioned, abroad. I mean, as Kennedy mentioned,
yeah,
right,
mm,
into Syria, into Lebanon, etc.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So I mean, I think, in all honesty, I think everybody knows that there's no way this is just going to return to a status quo. And even when they talk about two-state solution, they're talking about the 1967 borders, which is when basically Israel illegally annexed territory, both in the occupied territories and in the Golan territory, which,
Hmm.
again, you mentioned the UN. The UNGA has consistently said Israel shouldn't be in the Golan territories, but what does it actually do about it? You know, I mean, this is the most extraordinary thing. If any other country, I mean, imagine if Russia or China or Syria or Libya were to be carrying on in the way that Israel were. I mean, we'd be at complete annihilation by now, right? It's extraordinary that Israel is just enabled because of what it is. And I'll come back to Kennedy because he's made it absolutely crystal clear what Israel means to the US. And by the US, of course, I'm also talking about the UK and to some degree France
Hmm.
and Germany, right? Um, so I don't see now, honestly, any way back. It's impossible. It's impossible to go back. For me, the only solution has always been one state, and one state of Palestine, the dismantling of the Zionist, colonialist, settler state, and the return to the land of Palestine, where Christians and Jews and Arabs, Muslims, can live peacefully side by side and rebuild the country. Now, how far away we are from that, I really don't know. Honestly, I
Yeah.
don't know. But the one thing that I do have is the impression, both from speaking to people here, from listening to, for example, that interview today at Press TV with the Hezbollah guy. I think what this resistance operation has done, it's actually pushed them beyond the boundaries of what they thought they could achieve. I think it's made them realize actually we can go that far,
Hmm.
right? Because I think the idea or the strategy behind the 7th of October was kind of, it appears to be relatively limited in the sense of taking hostages in order to get the release of those, I think, around 5,000 Palestinian prisoners, including children in the
Hmm.
occupied territories, right, to end the siege on Gaza using the hostage strategy to do so. But I think they suddenly realized that actually this is going to end up much, much bigger than that. And so you've seen an adjustment by the resistance axis to actually accommodate that. Um, in my heart of hearts, I really hope so, you know, because um, the settler state should not be there anyway. It is illegally on Palestinian territory. It should be dismantled. And it should be returned to Palestine. It should be returned to pre-1947 borders. Not 67 borders. That's insane.
Yeah.
Even 47 borders were completely criminal, really,
Hmm.
because up until that point, the European settlers only had 7% of Palestinian territory.
Yeah. It's It's crazy. And Palestine, again, when people say, well, why didn't the Palestinians, why didn't they want a two-state solution? They tried it. They tried it, and it wasn't even fair anyway
Mm,
to begin with, at all whatsoever. And I guess the last thing I just want to touch on is,
mm,
where I there's really, it's hard to talk about a solution other than what you stated, and I do think that Israel has shown its weakness, right? As a paper
yeah.
tiger, right? When we talk about what happened on October 7th, so many people were flabbergasted that Israel, the all, intelligence apparatus with all of this money and weapons, and then we see the videos of the resistance fighters destroying these tanks, these expensive tanks of the latest
Yeah.
technology. Just they're useless. They're rendered useless in the battlefield, because of that. I don't think Israel will be looked at the same ever again. And I'm not just talking about the global south and countries that have given their support to Palestine. I'm talking about the entire world. I mean, including the West. I don't think Israel is going to be looked on as the same, because what we saw with South Africa, what we learned is you can't have an apartheid state. It can't exist. It's impossible. And what we're seeing with Russia, Ukraine is also the same thing, right? You can't have
Mm,
these factions really in government if you're going to have a semblance of functioning peace. It's just
mm,
impossible to have a government that exists as a fascist state. And Zionism, in my opinion, is fascism, because
yeah.
um, any belief where you're placing people above another, whether it's Christian Zionism or
Mm,
Israeli Zionism. This is why we're seeing so many people of Jewish faith literally say, this is not a part of us. This is not what we represent. This doesn't represent Judaism. I don't think we're going to see Israel ever again. How do you think Israel is going to come out of this, in your opinion?
um, that's a good question. I mean, I think without the US support and without the support of the UK and the EU, um, we would see like imagine, for example, that Israel was not important to the US in the way that it is. This would be over by now, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. The US can stop this overnight by picking the phone up and saying, okay, like if you don't stop this, we're going to end all the funding. We're going to withdraw our weapons. They can stop it in a heartbeat. So that tells you how weak Israel is. Its military, its kind of infantry military, or its on the ground military is weak. I mean, they're used to just policing the streets full of kids. They're not used to fighting guerrilla warfare, urban guerrilla warfare, which they're facing in Gaza.
Right.
And I think in the end, the casualties are going to be way higher than they're actually kind of, putting out right now. And when you're seeing a Palestinian resistance fighter literally walking up to a tank to put on the explosive device in full view of the tank itself, right? That kind of bravery doesn't come from the bullies that the Zionists are. That bravery comes from people that have nothing left to lose. And
Yeah.
and that's the huge difference, right? They don't have anything left to lose. And a friend of mine, Yusuf Al Jamal, he wrote a beautiful article. I think it was about a week ago. And at the end of it, he said, we're never going to leave Gaza. We're closer to heaven than to the Sinai. Because they've lived through generations of ethnic cleansing from 1948 to 1967 and onwards. Even Palestinians here who've never been able to go back to Palestine will still wear something that their grandmother brought with them out of Palestine. It's in the blood. And as the Hezbollah guy said, if we're facing annihilation of Palestinians, then we're not going to allow that to happen. Right. And
Yeah.
so I think now literally I see it almost like a sock puppet with the US hand, keeping it going. and keeping bombing and keeping destroying hospitals and schools and mosques and roads and infrastructure and blowing people's houses up. But from a world image perspective, I don't see how it's ever going to come back from this, ever. And with the pivot to the east, the pivot to the BRICS, I mean, the BRICS countries are pretty horrified. So
Minus
I
Saudi
hope,
Arabia,
well, yeah,
which is expected, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And Jordan, but I mean, they're not BRICS, but yeah, I know what you mean. But nevertheless, I think eventually, when that weakness is really exposed, I think Saudi isn't stupid. It's going to kind of come into line with BRICS far more than it is right now. It's kind of trying to play both ends against the middle, and that never works. Eventually, it never works.
Yeah, like Erdogan.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'll still keep sending oil to Israel, but I'm going to tell them they're a terrorist state. It's just like whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I just think we've got a long way to go. What does give me hope is this cohesion of the resistance. And as Assad said, we can't afford to keep giving peace processes and to give like the hand of peace to the Zionist entity, because it doesn't work. All that happens is it becomes more ferocious against us. So I think when you look at his words, you look at Iran, you look at Yemen, I always kind of just smile with Yemen because they've suffered so much. And I mean, they actually said if we had a land road to get to Palestine, we have 2 million fighters that will go there tomorrow. And then I swear to you, it would be over. It's just like,
And
you
it's
have to
crazy
love
because
them.
they've lost so much. They
Yeah.
literally are the people who should the least be capable of going out there and saying, we're going to give, everything we've got to you. And it's crazy how it happens like that usually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's absolutely hats off to them. As a people, they're amazing. They've kept this pure revolutionary spirit, and with such bravery, such courage, for nearly 8 years. And now, as you said, to commit themselves to potentially further pulverizing, because they are openly targeting Israel. We know the US is building up its naval forces there. But as they said, we will not betray our ethics, our morals, our humanitarian reflex. And you have to admire them. There's very few countries left in the world like that these days, to be honest.
Very few people too.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Vanessa, for coming on and sharing your knowledge with us this time around. I really appreciate it. Let everybody know where they can find you besides Substack. I know you have Twitter, Substack, and Telegram.
Yeah, those are the main ones. I'm also still on Patreon, but Substack's really the main one now for people to follow me. I'm still kind of clinging. I always say this, I'm clinging onto YouTube before my next strike, but I'm back on again at the moment.
Oh, okay. We'll see what happens. Unfortunately, yeah, you can't really trust YouTube. But thanks so much for coming on. I know it's late for both of us, so we'll see you next time.
Yeah, thanks,
Much
Fee.
love.
It was lovely talking to you as always. Take care.
Bye. Jamie, do we have any super chats? If not, I'll just say bye-bye to everybody. Okay. So this is from the previous show. This is from Kareem. He said all of the isms were creations of the British. Wish she would have said that when Vanessa was here. Maybe she would have agreed. Okay. And if that's it, hemp car tip $2. If you have not met with the Israeli peace movement, you should, so that you can play part in the historic effort to establish broad and deep peace between the two Semitic peoples. The exchanges should be videotaped and widely. No, I haven't. Oh, and distributed to further the cause of peace and to witness Abraham Foxman dialoguing without his customary lines that evade the issues. Ralph Nader. Interesting. Um, it's interesting. I haven't. I've heard different things about, pro peace activists in Israel, because there's a lot of them that don't really talk about the ending of what Israel is doing. And so you have these two gigantically different points of views, uh, that I think at this point in where Palestinians are at and the resistance is at, just aren't going to go back to this sort of establishing peace in a two-state solution aspect. Because, like as I said, it didn't work before, when it was tried in 1988, and then through the before until 1994, basically they had created the government of a Palestinian sort of, uh, not a state. They didn't even call it a state. They called it like its own, like a separate territory. And so that's when they were allowed to elect the Palestinian Authority and have Yusuf Arafat as their first president. Um, and then that whole thing became the Oslo two accords, and it just didn't work because Israel didn't want to be a part of, uh, with Palestinians. They didn't want coexistence. It's been tried again. So I know that the diplomatic aspect of governments still pushes a two-state solution. The UN pushes a two-state solution, but as Vanessa said, in reality, that's kind of, just not really a real solution. And also, as we learned in history from the apartheid in South Africa, that's the only way, is a one-state solution. So anyway, Hemkar said, yeah, I don't know who Nader was referring to, but the idea of being the Zionist before camera so the world can witness their lies and crimes. Okay. All right, guys. And Super Ray also, and that is why, because of the nuclear proliferation, support the idea of a joint US-Soviet cooperation. There's a huge amount of exploration to do, and all of it, every step that I described could be before the television cameras of the world, and we could all participate in such an exploration. Carl Sagan. That would have been nice, but instead, we're continuing the Cold War. That's pretty much turned into a hot war with Russia, Ukraine. So that's the unfortunate part. Gregory Orgy Walker, Fee, the great American philosopher Rick James once said, "Fuck yo, convo couch." Maybe paraphrasing. I don't know. I'm not quite sure about Rick James. I know he liked certain substances like cocaine, but other than that, I'm not entirely sure what he quoted. I'll look it up though. Guys, thanks so much for tuning in to this interview with Vanessa. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my new channel, because again, I'll be doing a lot more stuff there. Also, Pasta is at Lahaina. He's in Lahaina right now, and so he'll probably be coming back with his second documentary. And when he comes back, we'll be talking about it, I'm sure. But he doesn't really have good internet right now, so that's part of it. Not having good internet, I understand, is terrible. So we'll see you when we see you. We'll probably see you, if not tomorrow, Friday. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.